Ronan Lancaster stepped out of his sleek black Range Rover onto the gravel driveway of his new home, exhaling sharply as he took in the quiet, sprawling landscape around him. The rolling hills, the towering pines, the utter stillness, it was the exact opposite of the chaos he had escaped in New York. No more board meetings, no more flashing cameras, no more suffocating expectations, just peace. At least, that was the plan. He hadn't told anyone why he'd left the city. The world knew him as the young, millionaire tech genius who built an empire before 30. To them, he had everything: money, power, influence. But none of it mattered when his life felt like a never-ending performance, every move scrutinized, every decision picked apart. He needed a break. A real one. Somewhere no one knew him, where he wasn't Ronan Lancaster, CEO, just Ronan. The house was a modern cabin, luxurious yet understated, perched on the edge of a quiet lake in a small town no one had ever heard of. Population, barely over 1,000. It was perfect. Or so he thought until he met her. The first time he saw Madeline Hayes, she was standing behind the counter of the Rusty Bean, the town's only coffee shop, her dark curls piled into a messy bun, an old flannel tied around her waist. She was arguing no, passionately debating with an older man about the proper way to make a cappuccino. "Harold," she huffed, hands on her hips. "I love you, but if you put cinnamon on top of that foam one more time, I swear I will ban you from this café." The old man chuckled, completely unbothered. "Maddie, sweetheart, I've been drinking cappuccinos longer than you've been alive. You don't know what you're missing." "You're ruining the integrity of the drink," she countered, then turned to Ronan, who had been standing there, waiting, completely unnoticed. "Sorry, what can I get you?" For a moment he just stared. She was radiant. Not in the polished, designer-clad way of the women he knew in the city, but in an effortless, sun-kissed way that made her seem real. And when she looked at him, it wasn't with recognition or intrigue, it was with impatience. "A black coffee," he said quickly, shaking himself out of it. She arched a brow. "That's it." "No sugar, no cream?" "No." She gave a dramatic sigh and grabbed a cup. "You're missing out." He sat by the window, sipping his coffee, listening to the easy rhythm of the café, the way people actually talked to one another, how Madeline knew everyone's names, how she laughed like she had never been forced to fake a smile in her life. This town was different, and so was she. Ronan didn't expect to keep running into her, but in a town this small, it was inevitable. The second time, it was at the grocery store. He reached for the last carton of eggs at the same time she did. "Oh, come on," she groaned. "You don't even look like you cook." He bit back a smile. "I do." "Fine." "Rock, paper, scissors," he blinked. "You're joking." She crossed her arms. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He won. But when he saw the way her face fell, he sighed and handed her the carton. She looked at him, surprised. "Seriously?" "Consider it an act of goodwill." She studied him for a second before giving a small nod. "All right." "I owe you one, mystery man." "Ronan." "Madeline," she said, then smirked. "But you can call me Maddie." He didn't know it then, but that moment giving up a stupid carton of eggs would change everything. The third time, it was at the lake. He had been sitting on the dock, enjoying the quiet when she appeared, barefoot, a book in one hand and a coffee in the other. "You're in my spot," she announced. He raised a brow. "Didn't see your name on it." She plopped down beside him anyway. "It's an unspoken rule." They sat in silence for a while, watching the water ripple. It was strange. In the city, silence was suffocating. Here with her it felt peaceful. "You're new," she finally said. "Yeah." "Why'd you move here?" He hesitated. No one in this town knew who he was. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to keep it that way. "I needed a change." She nodded like she understood. "Well, welcome to Maplewood, Ronan." And just like that, He had a feeling his peaceful getaway was about to become a lot more complicated. Ronan had planned on keeping to himself. The whole point of moving here was to disappear, to exist without the constant pressure of being someone people expected him to be. But somehow, Maddie kept pulling him into her world. It started with small things, an occasional conversation at the café, a nod of acknowledgement when they crossed paths in town. But then, without realizing how it happened, Ronan found himself becoming part of the town's rhythm. One evening, he was walking past the café just as Maddie was flipping the sign on the door to closed. She spotted him and, without hesitation, called out. "You look like someone who could use a real meal," she said, tilting her head toward the cozy diner down the street. He hesitated. He wasn't used to people inviting him places without an agenda. In his world, every interaction had layers: business, expectations, hidden motives. But Maddie, she was different. Against his better judgment, he found himself following her inside. The diner was warm, the kind of place that felt like it had existed forever. The scent of home-cooked meals filled the air, and the soft hum of conversation made the space feel alive. Maddie greeted nearly everyone by name, her energy effortless, as if she belonged to this town in a way he never could. They slid into a booth, and before he could even glance at the menu, she waved a hand. "Don't bother, you need to try the pot roast. It'll change your life." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold statement." "You'll see," she said confidently. As the meal arrived, Ronan found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. Maddie talked about the town, the people, how she had grown up here and left for a while before coming back. "I thought I wanted the city," she admitted, swirling her spoon in her soup. "But it turns out I just wanted to prove I could leave. Once I did, I realized I didn't want to stay gone." He listened, absorbing every word. She had left and chosen to return. Meanwhile, he had done the opposite, fled a life everyone thought was perfect, still unsure if he had made the right decision. And then, without thinking, he asked, "What would you have done if you stayed in the city?" She shrugged. "Probably something practical, but I like it here. People care about each other in ways that don't feel forced. You don't get that in places where everyone's rushing to be something." His chest tightened. She had no idea how much those words hit home. That night, as he walked back to his house, he realized something unsettling. Maddie wasn't just a distraction. She was making him feel something he hadn't allowed himself to in a long time, like he belonged somewhere. And that was dangerous. A week later, Ronan found himself at the town's autumn festival, something he never would have imagined attending. But Maddie had insisted. "You can't live here and miss this," she had said, dragging him toward the town square where vendors had set up booths and strings of golden lights hung overhead. He could have refused. He should have. But somehow, Maddie had a way of making it impossible to say no. The festival was unlike anything he had ever experienced. People weren't trying to impress anyone. They weren't networking or calculating their next move. They were just happy. Maddie led him through the crowd, introducing him to people, making him feel like he had been part of this town forever. At some point, they ended up at a booth where people were lining up for a pie-eating contest. Before he could react, Maddie grinned and nudged him forward. "I dare you," he stared at her. "You want me to enter a pie-eating contest?" "Unless you're scared," she teased, crossing her arms. He huffed a laugh. "You think I scare that easily? Prove it." And just like that, he found himself seated at a table, staring at an absurdly large pie while the town cheered around him. The contest was ridiculous, messy, and completely out of character for him. But when he looked up and saw Maddie laughing, her eyes shining with amusement, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about anything else, not work, not the weight of expectations, not the past he had left behind. He was just present, and it was because of her. That night, As the festival wound down, Maddie and Ronan found themselves by the lake, the water reflecting the glow of the lights from town. She kicked off her shoes, letting her toes skim the cool surface. "You've been here a while now. What do you think?" He thought about everything: the quiet mornings, the way people actually talked to each other, the way Maddie had somehow made him feel like he wasn't just passing through. "It's different," he admitted. "Good different or bad different?" she asked, watching him closely. He hesitated. "I haven't decided yet," she nodded, as if she understood more than he had said. "Well, you've at least learned one important thing." He raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" She grinned. "That you're absolutely terrible at pie-eating contests." He let out a surprised laugh, shaking his head. "I let you talk me into that." "You had fun," she pointed out. He didn't deny it. As the night stretched on, something settled between them. A quiet understanding, an unspoken shift. Ronan had come here for peace. But Maddie, she was chaos in the best way possible. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which one he wanted more. Ronan had never been one for small-town routines, but somehow, without realizing it, he had become part of them. His presence at the café was expected each morning, Maddie sliding him a coffee before he even had to ask. The townspeople, once politely distant, now greeted him like he'd always been there. He was no longer just an outsider passing through, he was settling in, and Maddie was at the center of it all. One evening, as he walked past the café, he noticed her struggling with a tangled string of lights outside the shop. Autumn had given way to early winter, and the town was preparing for its annual holiday festival. Maddie was on her tiptoes, trying to loop the strand around a post, muttering under her breath as the bulbs flickered uncooperatively. "Need help?" Ronan asked, stepping closer. She glanced at him, cheeks slightly flushed from the cold. "Only if you're prepared to battle against these lights. They have a mind of their own." Without a word, he took the strand from her, easily reaching up to secure it in place. She folded her arms and watched him work. "Convenient," she mused. "Tall and useful." He glanced down at her, expression unreadable. "That why you keep me around?" She tilted her head, pretending to consider. "That and your surprisingly decent company." He finished fastening the last bulb, then turned to her. "High praise." She gave a small shrug. "I don't hand it out often." The moment stretched between them, the golden glow of the lights casting soft shadows on her face. There was something different in the way she was looking at him, something unspoken but undeniable. Before he could say anything, someone called her name from across the street. She blinked, breaking the spell, and waved in acknowledgement. "Looks like I'm needed," she said. "Thanks for the help." He nodded, watching as she walked away, her presence lingering even after she disappeared into the crowd. He had come here for quiet. Instead, he had found Maddie. And that was starting to feel far more dangerous than anything he had left behind. A few nights later, the festival was in full swing. The entire town had transformed into a winter wonderland, twinkling lights strung across every storefront, the scent of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon filling the air. Ronan had never cared for holiday celebrations. In the city, they had always felt manufactured, another excuse for extravagant parties where people pretended to enjoy themselves. But here it was different. Here it was genuine, and Maddie was at the heart of it all. He found her by the bonfire, wrapped in a thick knit scarf, laughing as she handed out cups of hot cider. She spotted him and waved him over. "Didn't think you'd actually show up," she teased as he approached. "You dared me to," he reminded her. She grinned. "And you're incapable of ignoring a challenge." He accepted the cup she offered, the warmth soaking into his hands. "What exactly happens at this festival?" "Tradition," she said simply. "Music, food, and at the end of the night, everyone gathers for the lantern release." He arched a brow. "Lantern release." She nodded toward a group of people preparing delicate paper lanterns. Each one represents a wish for the coming year. He watched as families and couples wrote messages on their lanterns, the soft glow of the firelight illuminating their faces. It was something he had never seen before, people taking a moment to hope, to believe in something beyond the tangible. Maddie nudged him. "Come on." He followed her to a small table where she handed him a marker and a lantern. "Write something," she said. He hesitated. "Like what?" "Anything." "A wish, a goal, something you want to let go of." He glanced at her, then down at the blank paper in his hands. He had spent so long running, avoiding, burying himself in work. What did he even wish for anymore? After a long moment, he finally wrote something down. Maddie didn't ask what it was. She just smiled and led him toward the lake where the others were gathering. As the countdown began, she met his gaze. Ready, he wasn't sure, but when the signal was given, he let go. The lantern floated upward, joining hundreds of others, the sky filling with soft golden light. It was simple, fleeting. And yet, standing there with Maddie, watching the glow reflect in her eyes, he felt something shift inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for. The cold air swept through the town, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke, but Ronan barely noticed. His attention was fixed on Maddie, who stood beside him, her face illuminated by the last of the floating lanterns. The glow reflected in her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if she had any idea just how much she had changed everything for him. He had come here to escape, to disappear. Instead, he had found her. Days passed, and the town settled into the quiet lull of early winter. Snow dusted the rooftops, and the lake had begun to freeze along the edges. Ronan found himself more entangled in Maddie's world than he had ever planned to be. He wasn't just an observer anymore, he was part of the town's heartbeat. One evening, he arrived at the café just as Maddie was locking up. She had a wool hat pulled low over her ears, her breath visible in the crisp air. "You're late," she teased, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "I wasn't aware I was on a schedule," she grinned. "You kind of are." "You've become a regular." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "That a bad thing?" She shook her head. "Not at all, just unexpected." For her, maybe, but for him. He had stopped questioning why he kept coming back. The answer was standing right in front of him. Maddie tilted her head, studying him. "Come on. Walk with me." They set off down the quiet street, their footsteps crunching against the thin layer of snow. The town was wrapped in silence, the only sound the occasional distant laughter from a warmly lit house. She glanced at him. "You never talk about where you lived before." There it was. The question she had never asked outright. He had known it would come eventually. He exhaled, watching the breath escape him like a ghost. "New York," she nodded, waiting. "I built a company," he continued after a pause. "It grew fast, too fast. Suddenly, I was at the center of everything: meetings, interviews, expectations. It never stopped." She listened, her expression unreadable. "I thought success would mean freedom," he admitted. "But the higher I climbed, the less of my life I actually owned." Maddie slowed her steps, considering his words. "So you left?" "I had to," he said simply. She glanced up at him. "Do you regret it?" He thought about that for a long moment. The long nights in his high-rise office, the exhaustion he had mistaken for ambition, the empty victories that never felt like enough. Then he looked at her. "No," he said, voice quieter this time. Something flickered across her face, something she didn't say out loud. Instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his in the cold. He didn't let go. The first snowfall of the season came without warning. By morning, the town was blanketed in white, and the lake had frozen solid enough for skating. The townspeople gathered, children laughing as they stumbled onto the ice, couples gliding effortlessly under the pale winter sun. Maddie dragged Ronan toward the frozen lake, her excitement infectious. "You're not getting out of this," she warned, lacing up her skates. He eyed the ice warily. "I'm not exactly an expert," she grinned. "That makes two of us." With a deep breath, he stepped onto the ice, immediately regretting it as his balance wavered. Maddie reached for his arm, steadying him. "Relax," she laughed. "You're overthinking it." He shot her a look. "Easy for you to say." Their fingers intertwined as she led him forward, guiding him slowly across the ice. The moment was absurd him, the man who had once lived his life in boardrooms and chauffeured cars, now slipping across a frozen lake in a remote town. And yet, he wouldn't trade it for anything. At one point, Maddie lost her balance, and in trying to catch her, Ronan ended up falling backward, bringing her down with him. They landed in a heap, laughter spilling into the cold air as snowflakes drifted down around them. She lay beside him, breathless, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Maybe we're both terrible at this," she admitted. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. "Maybe." The laughter faded, replaced by something softer. Then, without thinking, without hesitating, he reached for her. Their lips met in the middle of the frozen lake, surrounded by the quiet hum of winter and the distant sounds of the town. The world blurred, narrowed down to this her warmth against him, the way she melted into the kiss as if she had been waiting for it all along. When they finally pulled apart, Maddie exhaled a soft laugh. "Took you long enough," he smiled, his forehead resting against hers. "Worth the wait," she grinned. "Absolutely." After that, everything changed. The space between them, once filled with unspoken words and lingering glances, dissolved. They were inseparable now. Morning coffee turned into long walks, late nights spent by the lake, quiet moments woven into the fabric of their days. Ronan had never been one for sentimentality, but with Maddie, every second felt significant. One evening, as they sat in front of her fireplace, a storm raging outside, she curled into his side, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're staying, aren't you?" He looked down at her, at the way her fingers traced absent patterns against his arm. "I don't know," he admitted. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. But when she lifted her gaze to his, she didn't look disappointed. "Just promise me something," she said. "Anything." She held his gaze. "Don't leave just because you think you have to." The words settled in his chest, heavy and real. For so long, he had defined his life by what was expected of him. But here, in this town with Maddie, he had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for. Something worth staying for. And for the first time, he realized he didn't want to leave. Not now. Not ever. Ronan stood at the edge of the lake, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, watching as the last hints of daylight faded into the horizon. The town had settled into the quiet of early winter, the streets lined with twinkling lights, and the distant hum of laughter spilling from shop fronts. Snow crunched under his boots as he shifted his weight, his breath curling in the cold air. Maddie was late, not that he minded. He had grown used to her unpredictable nature, the way she always seemed to arrive precisely when he least expected but most needed her. He had spent so much of his life operating on strict schedules, every second accounted for. With Maddie, time stretched, unrushed, each moment unfolding naturally. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned just as she appeared, wrapped in a thick wool coat, her curls tucked beneath a knitted hat. She had a thermos in one hand and a mischievous glint in her eye. She extended the thermos toward him without a word. He accepted it, twisting off the lid. The rich scent of cocoa drifted up, mingling with the crisp winter air. He took a sip, warmth settling in his chest, though he had a feeling it had more to do with her presence than the drink itself. Maddie tucked her hands into her pockets, rocking on the balls of her feet. "You've been quiet today." Ronan exhaled slowly, considering his words. The past few weeks had unraveled something inside him, loosening the knots he had spent years tightening. He had come here expecting solitude, but instead, he had found something entirely different, something he wasn't sure how to walk away from. Instead of answering, he glanced at her. "You ever think about what's next?" She frowned slightly, as if the question had caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "For you," he clarified. "This town, your café, is this it? Or do you want more?" Maddie shifted, her gaze drifting to the frozen lake. "I used to think I had to want more, that staying in one place meant settling." She paused, drawing in a breath. "But now, more doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means different." Ronan studied her, the weight of her words settling deep. He had spent so much of his life chasing more success, more recognition, more control. And yet, standing here, surrounded by stillness, he realized that for the first time he wasn't searching for anything, because he had already found it. Maddie turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "What about you?" He hesitated. He had spent years defining himself by his work, his achievements. Walking away from it had felt like freeing himself from a cage, but now he wasn't sure if he had escaped or simply traded one uncertainty for another. But when he looked at Maddie, the answer came easier than he expected. "I think I've spent so long chasing something I thought I wanted that I never stopped to ask if it was making me happy." Her lips parted slightly, as if the honesty in his words surprised her. "And now?" she asked softly. Ronan reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Now, I think I finally understand what I was missing." Maddie exhaled, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "You really have changed, haven't you?" He thought about who he had been when he first arrived, the man who had kept himself at a distance, who had been so convinced that happiness only came from achievement. He nodded. "You changed me." Maddie squeezed his hand. "You let yourself change." The wind picked up, carrying the distant chime of church bells into the night. The town was preparing for its annual winter ball, something Maddie had been excited about for weeks. Ronan had never been one for grand events, but he knew this one mattered to her. And if it mattered to her, it mattered to him. The town hall had been transformed into something out of a storybook. Golden fairy lights lined the rafters, casting a warm glow over the polished wooden floors. The townspeople had traded their usual flannels and denim for elegant dresses and pressed suits. Laughter and music filled the air, creating an atmosphere that felt almost magical. Ronan adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, feeling slightly out of place. It had been years since he had attended anything resembling a formal event, but when Maddie had asked him to come with her, he hadn't hesitated. When she finally appeared, crossing the room toward him, the rest of the world faded. She wore a deep emerald dress, the fabric hugging her curves before flowing effortlessly with each step. Her hair, usually wild and untamed, had been styled in soft waves, framing her face. Ronan had seen countless women dressed in designer gowns, attending high-profile galas. But none of them had ever taken his breath away like this. Maddie stopped in front of him, tilting her head slightly. "You're staring." He didn't deny it. "Can you blame me?" A slow smile spread across her lips. "I suppose not." Someone called for the first dance, and couples began making their way to the center of the room. Ronan hesitated, but Maddie took his hand, pulling him forward. "You don't get to escape this," she teased. He let her lead him to the dance floor, placing one hand on her waist while the other held hers gently. The music started a slow, melodic tune that filled the space between them. They moved together, her body pressed close to his, each step effortless despite his lack of experience. Maddie rested her head against his chest, her voice barely above a whisper. "You feel different." Ronan tightened his hold on her. "Different how?" "Lighter," she murmured. "Like you finally stopped carrying the weight of the world." Maybe she was right. For so long, he had been defined by what he built, by the empire he had created. But here in this town, with Maddie in his arms, he realized something. Happiness wasn't in the things he had achieved. It was in the moments like this. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid to hold on to it. As the night drew to a close, Ronan and Maddie stepped outside, the cold air biting against their skin. Snow had begun to fall again, the flakes catching in her hair like tiny stars. He reached up, brushing them away gently. Maddie looked up at him, her expression soft. "So, have you decided?" He knew what she was asking. Was he staying? Ronan cupped her face, his thumb tracing along her cheek. "I already have," he said simply. Maddie's eyes shimmered, her breath hitching slightly. Then, without another word, she pulled him down into a kiss. And this time, he knew exactly where he belonged. The first true snowstorm of the season arrived overnight, blanketing the town in a thick layer of white. By morning, everything was hushed, the world slowed by the weight of fresh snow. Ronan woke to the sight of it from his cabin window, the lake frozen solid, the trees heavy with frost. The quiet felt different now, not isolating but inviting. Maddie had promised to meet him at the café before the town's annual sleigh ride through the woods. The thought of her made his chest tighten with something warm, something he had stopped trying to fight. By the time he arrived, the café was already bustling despite the snow. People huddled inside, seeking warmth, their laughter rising over the sound of clinking mugs. Maddie stood behind the counter, her sleeves pushed up, her cheeks pink from the cold. Their eyes met across the room, and she smiled. He hadn't realized how much he needed that smile until now. She handed off a tray of drinks to one of the regulars before making her way to him. "I was starting to think you were going to hibernate all winter." He leaned against the counter. "Tempting, but you'd probably drag me out anyway." "You're not wrong," she said, pouring him a coffee without asking. "You ready for the sleigh ride?" He had never been on one before. In the city, winter had been an inconvenient slush-covered streets, delayed meetings, the rush of people pushing past each other. Here, it was something else entirely. "I guess we'll find out," he said. She passed him his cup, her fingers brushing against his. "You're going to love it." And just like that, he already knew he would. The sleigh ride took them deep into the woods, where the snow-covered trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with ice. The horses moved at an easy pace, their breath visible in the cold air. Ronan sat beside Maddie, a thick wool blanket draped over their legs, the scent of pine filling the space between them. The town's families had piled into the other sleighs ahead, their laughter drifting back through the trees. But here, in the last sleigh, it was just the two of them, the rest of the world forgotten. Maddie tilted her head back, watching as the sky darkened into soft twilight. "I used to do this every year as a kid," she said. "I'd always try to stay out here as long as possible, pretending I wasn't freezing just so I didn't have to go back inside." He watched her, taking in the way her breath curled in the air, the way the fading light caught in her hair. "You always this stubborn?" She turned to him, her lips curving. "You're just now figuring that out." The sleigh hit a small bump, and she shifted closer to him, their shoulders pressing together. He didn't move away. Instead, he reached for her hand beneath the blanket, his fingers curling around hers. She stilled for a moment, then squeezed his hand in return. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Later that night, they found themselves back at his cabin, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Maddie sat on the floor, her back against the couch, her boots kicked off, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea he had made for her. Ronan sat beside her, his legs stretched out, the warmth of the fire flickering across his skin. She glanced at him. "You're different here." He looked at her, waiting. "In the beginning, you were always guarded," she said, "like you were waiting for an excuse to leave." He exhaled slowly. "I think I was." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "And now?" He reached for her, tucking a loose curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering at her jaw. "Now I don't want to leave." Something shifted in her eyes, something unspoken but undeniable. "You mean that?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Yeah." For the longest time, he had convinced himself that happiness was something he had to earn, something that came at the end of a long road of achievements. But here, with Maddie, with the quiet of the town and the warmth of the fire, he realized he had been wrong. Happiness wasn't something distant. It was here, now, with her. Maddie set her cup aside and turned to him fully, her hands resting against his chest. "Good," she whispered, "because I don't want you to leave either." And then she kissed him. It wasn't hurried or desperate, it was slow, deliberate, filled with everything they hadn't said out loud. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his sweater, pulling him closer, and he let himself sink into the feeling of her, of everything he had been afraid to admit. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Guess that means you're officially one of us now," he chuckled, his hands settling at her waist. "Think they'll accept me?" She grinned. "They already have." And for the first time in his life, Ronan Lancaster realized he didn't have to fight to prove himself. Here, he was already exactly where he belonged. With her, always.